The hum of the engine was steady, a low growl in the silence of the early morning as I made my way down the familiar stretch of highway. Out here in Iowa, these roads seemed to go on forever, winding through fields of corn that rose up like walls on either side of me. Just rows and rows of tall, swaying stalks, the leaves whispering secrets to each other in the dark. In the daylight, this was an ordinary route, mundane even, but in the pitch black, the emptiness felt overwhelming. I couldn't shake the strange sensation that there was something out there, watching from the shadows. The night was unusually quiet, too. Not even the distant call of a lone owl or the hum of distant traffic. It was just me, my car, and the relentless stretch of road beneath me. I kept my eyes fixed on the black ribbon of asphalt ahead, trying to fight off the creeping exhaustion that was settling heavily on my shoulders. The factory shift had been long, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, as if each hour spent on my feet had added a layer of lead. My eyes were starting to blur, and I had to shake my head to keep from nodding off. Blinking hard, I gripped the wheel tighter. I couldn't afford to fall asleep. Not here. There were no streetlights to guide me, no other cars to break up the darkness. I was on my own. The headlights cast a faint glow over the edges of the cornfields, and for a second I thought I saw something move. Just a quick flicker of motion, there and gone, a shadow darting between the stalks. My grip on the wheel tightened as I forced myself to keep driving. Just my imagination, I told myself, or maybe a stray animal. Nothing to worry about. But the longer I drove, the more I felt it, that unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone on this road. Out of nowhere, the car started to stutter, the engine coughing and spluttering before falling silent altogether. I felt the lurch as the car coasted to a stop, and my heart dropped. I'd had trouble with the engine before, but it had always managed to hold on long enough to get me home. This time, though, it seemed like I'd pushed it too far. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as the headlights dimmed, casting a sickly yellow light over the road ahead. "Come on," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. Nothing. I tried again, but the engine just groaned and fell silent, as if mocking me. With a frustrated sigh, I slumped back in my seat, realizing that I was well and truly stranded. 10 miles from home, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but cornfields and shadows for company. A part of me wanted to just stay put, to lock the doors and wait until morning when someone might drive by and offer a hand. But even as I considered it, I knew it wasn't an option. I couldn't afford to miss work in the morning, and there was no guarantee anyone would pass by this far out on such an isolated road. With a resigned sigh, I reached over to the glove compartment, pulling out my flashlight. The thought of walking all that way wasn't appealing, but it looked like I didn't have much of a choice. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. It was colder than I'd expected, and I cursed myself for not bringing a jacket. I'd figured I'd be in and out of the car, a quick trip with no need for extra layers. Now, as I stood in the quiet, empty darkness, I felt a chill that seemed to seep right into my bones. Switching on the flashlight, I took a few steps forward, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead. My car's hazard lights blinked behind me, a faint, dying heartbeat in the night. I glanced back one last time, feeling a strange pang of finality as I left it behind. Then, with a deep breath, I turned and started walking. The road stretched out before me, a thin, twisting path that disappeared into the black. Every few steps, I could hear the crunch of gravel under my boots, a sound that seemed almost deafening in the silence. The corn loomed high on either side, tall and oppressive, blocking out any trace of light from the sky above. I tried to keep my mind focused on the path ahead, but it was hard not to feel like I was being swallowed up by the darkness. As I walked, I felt the familiar ache in my feet start to return, a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to echo every step. I'd been on my feet all day, and now, with miles left to go, I could feel every blister, every sore spot. I reached into my pocket, fishing out a couple of ibuprofen tablets, and swallowed them dry, hoping they'd kick in soon. The wind picked up, rustling the corn around me, and I shivered, clutching my arms around myself. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of road and the silent rows of corn. The flashlight beam wavered as I forced myself to keep moving, but the nagging sensation of eyes on my back wouldn't go away. Each step felt heavier than the last as I moved down that endless road, the faint glow of my flashlight slicing through the dark. The ache in my feet was spreading up my legs, a gnawing pain that seemed to deepen with every minute. I kept telling myself that it wasn't that far, that home was just a few more miles down this road. But the silence, the emptiness, made it feel like I was the last person on Earth, lost in some endless corridor of darkness and corn. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning over to rest my hands on my knees. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, coming from somewhere within the rows of corn beside me. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heartbeat. It could have been the wind, I told myself, just the breeze stirring the dry leaves. But this rustling had a pattern to it, a slow, deliberate sound that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, squinting into the shadows. The beam barely pierced the dense stalks, revealing nothing but darkness. Still, the sound continued, moving parallel to me as though something or someone was keeping pace. My pulse quickened and I forced myself to keep walking, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. As I walked, the rustling grew louder, keeping rhythm with my steps. It was right there, just out of sight, hiding within the corn. I felt a prickle of fear rise up in my chest, a sharp, cold sensation that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My logical mind kept trying to reassure me, insisting it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But a deeper instinct told me this was something else, something more deliberate. I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between myself and whatever was in the corn. The sound followed me, speeding up to match my steps. My heart was racing now, a steady thump that drowned out the silence. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were made of lead, each step dragging me further into the unknown. Just when I thought the rustling couldn't get any closer, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, swinging the flashlight toward the edge of the field, and there it was. Two pale, glowing eyes, staring back at me from the shadows. They were too high up to belong to a coyote or even a deer. No, this was something else, something that didn't belong in a cornfield. The eyes blinked, disappearing for a second before reappearing a few feet closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The thing in the corn was moving toward me, slowly, almost cautiously, as if it were studying me, deciding whether I was worth the effort. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything that might break the spell of fear that held me in place, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as it came closer. A sickly white light reflected off its skin as it moved through the corn, revealing a grotesque figure with limbs that seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways. It had too many arms, too many legs, each one covered in jagged, thorn-like protrusions that glinted in the faint beam of my flashlight. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over bones that jutted out at odd angles. And those eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, were fixed on me, unblinking, filled with a hunger that sent a wave of nausea through me. The creature took another step, and I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run. I forced myself to turn, my feet finally obeying, and started to sprint down the road. My legs burned, the pain in my feet forgotten in the adrenaline-fueled panic that surged through me. Behind me, I could hear it moving, the sound of its claws scraping against the asphalt as it gave chase. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it gaining on me, its heavy breaths echoing through the quiet night, a harsh, ragged sound that filled me with dread. My lungs burned as I ran, each step sending a jolt of pain through my legs, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I knew it would catch me, and I didn't want to think about what would happen then. The road stretched on, an endless path that seemed to have no end. I was starting to lose hope, the fear and exhaustion wearing me down, when I spotted a faint light up ahead. A pair of headlights, distant but moving toward me. Relief flooded through me, and I stumbled forward, waving my arms frantically, hoping that whoever was driving would see me. The truck drew closer, the roar of its engine filling the air, drowning out the sound of the creature behind me. I kept running, my legs screaming in protest, until I was almost at the center of the road. The headlights were blinding, but I didn't care. I had to get the driver's attention. I couldn't let this chance slip away. Just as I was about to reach the road, something hard and sharp hit me in the back, shoving me forward. I fell, hitting the ground hard, my hands scraping against the rough asphalt. I rolled onto my side, gasping for breath, and looked back to see the creature standing at the edge of the road, its eyes locked on me with a cruel, almost mocking intensity. The truck was nearly upon me now, its horn blaring as the driver tried to avoid hitting me. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling to the side of the road just as the massive vehicle sped past, the wind from its wake nearly knocking me off balance. I watched as it disappeared down the road, its taillights fading into the distance, leaving me alone with the creature once more. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, me breathing heavily, it standing there in the shadows, waiting. I could feel the weight of its gaze, its hunger, and a new wave of fear gripped me. I could feel my heart pounding as I stood there, locked in the creature's gaze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the fear had rooted me to the spot, holding me in place like some twisted statue. The creature took a slow, deliberate step forward, its razor-edged limbs scraping against the asphalt, sending a harsh, grating sound through the night. My mind was racing, scrambling for any possible escape. I knew I couldn't outrun it, not with my legs feeling like jelly and the pain in my feet roaring back to life. The truck that had almost been my salvation was now just a pair of faint red dots in the distance, leaving me in total isolation once again. In desperation, I took a step backward, my hand reaching for the flashlight still clutched in my grip. I wasn't sure what I thought it would do against something like this, but it was all I had. I lifted it, aiming the beam at the creature's face. The light caught in its eyes, making them glint with an unnatural, almost metallic shine. It stopped, momentarily blinded, giving me a precious second to turn and bolt into the cornfield on the opposite side of the road. I crashed through the rows of tall stalks, not caring about the noise I was making. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between me and that thing. The corn scratched at my face and arms as I pushed through, the sharp leaves cutting into my skin, but I barely noticed the pain. My only focus was to keep moving, to stay hidden among the rows. I zigzagged through the field, ducking low to stay out of sight, just like I used to do as a kid playing hide and seek. Only this wasn't a game. I could still hear it, moving through the field somewhere behind me, its steps heavy and deliberate, its breathing low and guttural. It was hunting me, and it wasn't in any hurry. It knew I was trapped. I finally dropped to my knees, pressing myself as low to the ground as I could, trying to steady my breathing. Every muscle in my body was trembling, a mixture of exhaustion and terror. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to stay silent. For a few long moments, there was nothing but the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. And then I heard it again. The faint rustle of corn, the creature moving closer. My breath hitched as I looked through the narrow gaps between the stalks, catching glimpses of it weaving its way through the rows. Its pale skin glowed faintly in the moonlight, and I could see its limbs, those twisted, spiny appendages, moving with an unnatural grace. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything other than sit there in silence. But I knew that any sound would give me away. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to stay still, to become invisible. My fingers dug into the cold earth, clinging to the dirt like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. I counted each second in my head, waiting for it to pass me by, praying it wouldn't notice me huddled there in the shadows. The rustling grew louder, closer, until I could feel its presence just on the other side of the stalks. I dared to open my eyes, and I saw it, only a few feet away, its eyes scanning the rows, searching. I held my breath, barely daring to blink, afraid that even the slightest movement would draw its attention. After what felt like an eternity, it moved on, disappearing deeper into the field. I waited, counting to 100 in my head before finally daring to move. Slowly, carefully, I rose to my feet, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The moon was slipping behind clouds, plunging the field into deeper darkness. I knew I couldn't stay here, hiding among the corn. I needed to get back to the road, to find help. Steeling myself, I began to creep back the way I'd come, moving as silently as I could. I could still hear the creature moving somewhere nearby, but it seemed to have lost my trail. its movements more scattered now, less purposeful. With each step, I felt the fear loosening its grip on me, replaced by a single, desperate determination to survive. I finally broke free of the cornfield, stumbling back onto the road. The cold, open air felt like a shock after the suffocating closeness of the stalks. I looked both ways, hoping for a sign of headlights, of any vehicle that might offer a way out. But the road stretched empty in both directions, silent and unyielding. I turned left, heading in the direction of home, trying to ignore the steady, relentless pain in my feet. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing those eyes again, of knowing it was still there, watching me. Instead, I kept my gaze fixed on the road ahead, each step carrying me farther away from the nightmare I'd left behind. Then, as if by some miracle, I saw it. A pair of headlights cresting the hill in the distance, growing brighter with each second. I waved my arms frantically, hoping against hope that the driver would see me. The truck slowed, its brakes hissing as it pulled up alongside me. The window rolled down, and I saw the face of the driver, a woman with a look of bewildered concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice muffled by the hum of the engine. I didn't trust myself to speak. I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as I climbed into the cab. The warmth of the truck's interior was a shock after the biting cold outside, and I sank into the seat, feeling the tension finally start to drain from my body. As we pulled away, I glanced out the window, back at the cornfield we were leaving behind. For a brief second, I thought I saw something move among the rows, a flicker of white, a pair of eyes glinting in the darkness. But then it was gone, swallowed by the night as the truck rumbled down the road. The driver glanced at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Where were you coming from, out here in the middle of nowhere?" I hesitated, trying to find the words to explain what had happened, but I couldn't. How could I make someone else understand the horror I'd just been through? I shook my head, giving her a weak smile. "Just trying to get home." She nodded, seeming to sense that I didn't want to talk about it, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. The lights of my house came into view, and I felt a wave of relief as she pulled to a stop. I thanked her, my voice barely more than a whisper, and climbed out of the truck, feeling the cold air bite at my skin once more. As I walked up the path to my door, I glanced back one last time. The road was empty, the truck already disappearing into the night. But the memory of those eyes, that twisted, unnatural creature, stayed with me, lurking in the shadows of my mind. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering dread. I'd made it home, but something told me I'd never truly escape what I'd seen. Jake and I had been talking about a fishing trip for weeks. Just a weekend escape from the noise of the city and the endless routine of work. We'd both grown up near rivers and lakes, places where the water was always cool and shaded by old trees. There was something about the stillness of those spots, something peaceful that both of us missed in our lives. So when we finally picked a weekend, we were more than ready to go. The river was a good few hours' drive away, nestled between the hills and trees of southern Illinois. It was one of those hidden spots, one that you'd miss if you didn't already know where to look. We arrived early in the morning, the sun just beginning to break through the mist hanging over the water. A crisp, chilly breeze rustled the leaves, and for the first time in a while, I felt the weight of the daily grind lift just a little. We unloaded our gear, exchanged a few laughs, and set up on the bank. The first hour was quiet. We cast our lines, cracked open a couple of beers, and settled into the quiet, content to let the river do the talking. I glanced around, taking in the surroundings, the thick trees on the opposite bank, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting patterns on the water. It was a perfect scene, the kind you imagine when you dream about getting away from everything. But as the morning wore on, something started to feel off. At first, it was just a subtle feeling, a tingling at the base of my neck, like we were being watched. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my own imagination. After all, we were out in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing here but trees and water. Then, Jake tapped my shoulder, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Hey, look over there." he said, pointing upstream. Nestled between the trees, partially hidden by the overgrowth, was a building, a squat, abandoned structure with broken windows and a roof that looked ready to cave in. I hadn't noticed it when we first set up, and judging by Jake's reaction, he hadn't either. It looked old, maybe from the 50s or 60s, and something about it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the middle of this quiet forest. "What do you think it is?" I asked, trying to mask my growing curiosity with casual interest. "Only one way to find out," Jake replied with a grin, his eyes gleaming with that familiar glint of adventure. I knew he wouldn't let this go until we checked it out, and to be honest, I was just as curious as he was. Fishing could wait. Besides, what was the harm in a little exploring? We gathered our things, stashed the rods and cooler by a tree, and started walking toward the building. As we approached, the sounds of the river faded, replaced by an eerie silence that settled around us like a heavy fog. The closer we got, the more the building seemed to loom, its walls marred with graffiti and vines creeping up the sides. The windows were broken, some with shards of glass still clinging to the frames, and the door hung slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but Jake pushed on, clearly undeterred. "Come on, man," he urged, motioning me forward. With a deep breath, I followed, stepping carefully over the fallen branches and debris scattered around the entrance. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mold and decay, and I had to fight the urge to gag as we stepped through the doorway. The first room was empty, save for a few scattered objects: an old chair with one leg broken, a rusted metal shelf that looked like it hadn't held anything in decades. Dust coated every surface, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper, torn fabric, and a few broken toys. The sight of those toys unsettled me, a strange feeling creeping into my stomach as I wondered who had left them here and why. Jake didn't seem to notice my discomfort. He was already moving deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. "This place is weird," he muttered, running a hand along the wall as we walked. The graffiti on the walls was faded, barely visible, but I could make out strange symbols mixed in with the usual tags. Circles, lines, shapes that didn't quite make sense. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. As we turned a corner, we entered a narrow hallway that led to a series of smaller rooms. Each one was empty, but there were signs that people had been here at some point. Discarded wrappers, old cans, and what looked like bedding on the floor of one room. But it was the room at the end of the hallway that stopped us both in our tracks. The door was slightly open, and inside, arranged neatly in a line along the far wall, were 3 small coffins. They were child-sized, each one slightly different in design, with faded paint and chipped wood. A chill ran through me as I stepped closer, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. These coffins were far too small, and their presence here in this forgotten building felt like a violation of something sacred. Jake moved forward, his face pale as he reached out to touch one of them. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something about this place felt wrong, deeply wrong, like we were intruding on a space that had been left to its own dark secrets for a reason. We lingered in silence for a few moments, neither of us willing to be the first to speak, to break the spell of horror that hung over us. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thickening, as if the building itself was breathing, waiting. Finally, Jake took a step back, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Let's keep looking," he said, though his voice was unsteady. Part of me wanted to leave, to put as much distance as possible between us and those coffins. But curiosity and the strange pull of the building urged me on. We backed out of the room with the coffins, neither of us willing to look back. The whole place had taken on an eerie, oppressive quality, as if we'd crossed some invisible boundary. I could feel it now, a kind of tension in the air, like we were being watched by something lurking in the shadows. Jake seemed quieter too, his usual enthusiasm dulled by the weight of what we'd just seen. But despite the unease twisting in my stomach, I couldn't bring myself to turn back. We wandered through a few more rooms, each one filled with strange relics of a forgotten time. Broken toys, scattered papers, and odd pieces of furniture, all layered with dust and decay. It felt like we were walking through someone's memories, fragmented and left to rot in this forsaken place. The building seemed to sprawl out in unexpected ways, with narrow hallways branching off in different directions, leading us deeper into its decaying belly. The structure looked small from the outside, but once inside, it felt labyrinthine, as though the walls were shifting, guiding us deeper against our will. The next room we entered was different. Unlike the others, it was brightly painted, the walls covered in faded shades of yellow and blue. Images of animals and cartoon characters adorned the walls, cheerful and colorful despite the years of neglect. There were stars and moons painted on the ceiling, barely visible through the layers of dust and cobwebs that had gathered. It looked like a child's playroom, something meant to be welcoming, but instead it felt twisted, out of place, like a parody of happiness frozen in time. And then I noticed it, the barbed wire. The barbed wire was wrapped tightly around the walls, stretching across the door and windows, woven in thick, menacing coils. It seemed random at first, just another layer of decay in this forgotten place. But as I looked closer, the pattern became clear. The wire wasn't meant to keep people out, it was meant to keep something in. The wire was anchored into the walls, thick and sharp, with a layer of grime and rust that made it look like it had been here for years, undisturbed. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized what that meant. Someone had gone to great lengths to seal this room, like trapping whatever was inside. Jake was silent, standing just a few feet away from me, staring at the barbed wire with a look of horror on his face. What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. The whole setup felt wrong, unnatural, like we'd stumbled upon a secret that wasn't meant to be uncovered. As I stood there, I felt a sudden chill, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch in your throat. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with an unspoken threat, and for a moment I could almost feel something watching us. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. Jake took a step closer to the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the painted animals on the walls. There was something strange about them, something I hadn't noticed at first. The animals' faces seemed off, their eyes too wide, their smiles too sharp. It was as if they were watching us, mocking us, their cheerful expressions twisted into something sinister. I reached out instinctively, grabbing Jake's arm. "Let's get out of here," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We've seen enough." But he didn't move. His eyes were locked on one of the murals, a smiling bear painted in bright, garish colors. "Did you notice this?" he asked, his voice hollow. "The eyes, they're all staring at us." I hadn't noticed it at first, but he was right. All the animals, every cartoon character, every smiling face, they were all facing us, their eyes painted with a strange precision that made them feel almost alive. It was like they were following us, watching our every move, waiting for something. The silence in the room grew heavier, oppressive, as if the walls were pressing in around us. I felt a growing urge to run, to leave this place and never look back, but my feet wouldn't move. Jake's grip tightened on my arm, and I could feel the tension in his body, the same dread that was twisting inside me. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard a faint noise, a soft rustling, like the sound of something moving through the dust-laden air. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of my own fraying nerves, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere nearby, echoing through the hallways and empty rooms. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I nodded, barely able to breathe. The sound was getting closer, each soft rustle sending a jolt of fear through me. It felt like footsteps, light and hesitant, as though someone or something was creeping through the building, searching for us. Without a word, we backed out of the room, moving as quietly as we could, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The sound followed us, a soft, relentless shuffle that seemed to echo off the walls, filling the empty spaces with a growing sense of dread. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear clawing at my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. We turned a corner, stepping into another narrow hallway, and froze. There, at the end of the hall, was a shadow, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. It was small, child-sized, its outline blurred and indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on us, watching with a quiet intensity that made my skin crawl. Jake and I exchanged a glance, neither of us daring to speak. Slowly, the shadow moved, slipping back into the darkness, disappearing into one of the rooms. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our own shallow breaths. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Jake nodded, his face pale, and we turned back the way we came, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a run. The building seemed to shift around us, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing darker, deeper, as if they were closing in on us. But no matter how fast we moved, the sounds followed, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the faint whispers echoing through the hallways. It felt like the building itself was alive, breathing us in, drawing us deeper into its forgotten secrets. Every turn, every shadow seemed to hold something waiting, watching, like we'd awakened something that had been lying dormant for years. We finally reached the entrance, the open doorway spilling a faint beam of sunlight onto the floor. Relief washed over me as I stepped toward it, feeling the pull of the outside world, the safety of the daylight just beyond. But as we stepped through, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that the shadows themselves were reaching out, trying to pull us back in. The rush of relief as we finally stepped out into the open air was like a sudden gasp after holding my breath for too long. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and I could hear the distant trickle of the river again, grounding me, reassuring me that we were back in the real world. I felt Jake's hand on my shoulder, his grip steady but tense, both of us wordlessly sharing the same realization. We were lucky to be out of there. But that relief was short-lived. As we began to make our way back toward our gear, every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig felt amplified, like the forest itself had taken on the eerie quiet we'd felt inside. I could still feel the weight of that building behind us, an oppressive energy pressing against my back as though urging us to leave faster. But with every step, I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't quite right. It felt as though the boundary between the abandoned building and the outside world had blurred, as if we'd brought something out with us. "Hey, did you see that shadow?" I asked Jake, keeping my voice low, though the question sounded absurd in the safety of the daylight. I half expected him to laugh it off, to chalk it up to the dim light and our overactive imaginations. But Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with something I'd never seen before. "Yeah, I saw it." His voice was barely more than a whisper. And I don't think it was just the light. He looked back, staring into the shadows of the trees, as if expecting something to be there, just out of sight. We reached our gear, and the sight of our fishing rods and cooler felt almost surreal, like remnants from another world. The untouched simplicity of it all felt wrong after what we just experienced, like it didn't belong to the reality we'd just emerged from. My instinct was to pack up and get out of there as fast as we could, but part of me kept glancing back toward the building, that strange pull still lingering. I wasn't sure if it was fear or fascination, but I could feel something urging me to look again, to see if it was really over. As we packed up, I heard it. The faint sound of children's laughter drifting from somewhere far behind us. My whole body froze. It was soft, distant, as though carried by the wind, but unmistakable. I looked at Jake and I knew he'd heard it too. His face was white, his hands trembling slightly as he stuffed the rods back into the bag, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight, the words clipped and hurried. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't talk as we walked back to the car. Every rustle, every whisper of wind through the leaves felt like it was following us, closing in with each step. The path we'd come down felt longer now, winding and unfamiliar, as if the forest had shifted around us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowed figure again, watching us from a distance. But each time, there was nothing, just trees and silence, the kind that felt heavy, waiting. Finally, the car came into view, parked just where we'd left it on the dirt trail. We climbed in without another word, slamming the doors behind us, both of us eager to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. As I started the engine, I risked one last glance back at the path we just walked. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a faint shape slipping between the trees, dark and small, like a child. I tore my gaze away, gripping the steering wheel as I pulled onto the road, pushing the car faster than I usually would on a dirt trail. Neither of us spoke. The silence in the car thick with unspoken fear, as if saying anything would invite whatever was lurking in that place to follow us. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just our nerves, that we'd let our imaginations get the best of us. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something we'd disturbed. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of the forest and turned onto the main road. The scenery became familiar again. Farmhouses, telephone poles, signs of life. The normalcy of it felt strange, like we were stepping back into a world that didn't know about the things hiding in forgotten buildings by the river. I glanced at Jake, hoping to see some of the tension ease from his face now that we were safely away. But he still looked haunted, his eyes distant, lost in thought. "We're never going back there," he muttered, almost to himself. "No," I agreed, gripping the wheel tighter. "We're not." As we drove back toward town, the shadows of the trees stretched long over the road, and I could still hear that faint echo of laughter, a sound that would stay with me long after we left the river behind. The drive felt longer than it should have, like we couldn't quite leave that place, like it had taken a part of us with it. Even when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling. The quiet of my own room felt foreign, almost hostile, as if something was waiting, hiding in the shadows. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still see the faces painted on the walls of that playroom, the wide, unnatural eyes staring back at me with that eerie, painted smile. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with the same twisted images. The small coffins, the barbed wire, the shadowed figure at the end of the hall. Each time I thought I was alone, I'd hear that laughter again, faint and mocking, echoing through my mind like a whisper from a forgotten memory. Days went by, but I couldn't escape it. Jake and I stopped talking about the trip, both of us pretending it was just a bad memory, something to bury in the past. There was a part of me that couldn't forget, a part that kept replaying every moment, wondering what had been left behind in that building. I tried to push it out of my mind to let it fade, but the memory I couldn't shake a weight. It was a week later, late at night, when I got a message from Jake. Just a few words, I can still hear them. The laughter. I stared at the screen, a chill running down my spine as I read the words over and over. My mind flashing back to that moment in the playroom, the wire, the shadows, the laughter. I wanted to respond, to tell him it was nothing, that we'd imagined it, but the truth settled heavy in my chest. I can still hear it too, lingering at the edge of my thoughts, an echo from that place that would never truly leave us. I never did reply. We drifted apart after that, each of us haunted in our own way by what we'd seen. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the house is dark and silent, I still hear it. A faint, distant laughter, as if from some hidden corner of my mind. And in those moments, I can't shake the feeling that the shadows from that place are still watching, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. The sound of drilling was what woke me that morning, a harsh, buzzing hum that echoed through the walls and made my head throb. I glanced at my phone. Barely 8 a.m. My mom and stepdad Tom were already at work, which left me alone in the house, or so I thought. At first, I brushed it off. Tom had mentioned a few days ago that he was planning to hire someone to fix the lights in the hallway. I figured he'd arranged for the electricians to come while I was still sleeping. He was always doing things like that without much of a heads up, and I was used to it by now. So I threw on a hoodie, slid into my slippers, and shuffled out of my room, still groggy from sleep. As I stepped into the hallway, I immediately spotted them. Two men, both wearing identical navy blue uniforms and tool belts. They were standing on either side of the hallway ladder, one of them focused on securing a light fixture to the ceiling, while the other stood at the bottom, holding tools and glancing down at a smartphone as if checking instructions. They looked perfectly normal, as if they belonged there like any other repair crew. Hey, I mumbled, more out of politeness than anything else. The man on the ladder barely acknowledged me, just a quick nod as he continued adjusting the wires. The other guy, though, looked up and gave me a brief, tight smile, his gaze lingering on me for a beat longer than I expected. It felt like a strange look, but maybe it was just me still half asleep. "Are you with the electric company?" I asked, hoping to shake off the weirdness. The man holding the tools nodded. Yeah, just here to fix the lights," he said, his voice flat and efficient. He didn't say much else, and I decided not to press the matter. After all, they were just here to do a job. I shrugged it off and headed back to my room, closing the door behind me. But as I lay back down, a weird feeling settled in. Something about them didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way they didn't introduce themselves or explain anything, or how they barely seemed interested in acknowledging me at all. I tried to ignore the prickling discomfort, chalking it up to my paranoia. Still, as I stared at the ceiling, that feeling gnawed at me, a tiny whisper at the back of my mind that something was off. I finally got up again after half an hour, unable to shake the unease. When I stepped into the hallway this time, the drilling had stopped and the men were tidying up, gathering their tools and packing everything back into a large black case. The hallway lights were now gleaming brightly above, casting a steady glow across the walls. For a second, I felt a bit foolish for being so suspicious. They'd done exactly what they'd come to do. "Thanks for taking care of this," I said, attempting a friendly smile. The man who'd been on the ladder gave me a nod, his expression hard to read. His eyes flicked over me briefly before he looked down, tapping something into his phone. The other man didn't say anything. He just picked up their case, and with one last glance around, they headed toward the front door. I watched them leave, noticing the way they didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, just slipped out without a word. The door clicked shut behind them, and suddenly, the house felt very quiet. I stood there for a few seconds, a strange feeling settling over me as I stared at the closed door. It was silly, really, to feel uneasy after they'd done their job and left. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was out of place, like the normal rhythm of the house had been disrupted, leaving it strangely hollow. I told myself I was being paranoid. They were just workers doing their job, and I was overthinking it. Shaking my head, I went to the kitchen to grab some breakfast. I decided not to mention the strange feeling to Tom or my mom what was there to say. But as I sat there, scrolling through my phone and munching on toast, I found myself glancing down the hallway more than once, my eyes drawn to the new lights. They cast a soft, steady glow, illuminating every corner of the corridor. But instead of feeling cozy, the light felt intrusive, somehow harsh, as if it didn't belong. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Tom was the type to tell me about anything happening around the house, especially if strangers were coming over. I texted him asking if he'd arranged for any electricians to come by that morning, just in case. The response came quickly. "Electricians? No, not today." "Why?" My stomach twisted. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type. I stared at his response, feeling the first flickers of real fear creep in. If Tom hadn't called them, who had? And if they weren't supposed to be here, why had they shown up? "Two guys were here this morning, doing work on the lights," I finally typed. My fingers felt heavy, the words seeming to slow down as they formed on the screen. Tom's response was quick, but it only made my stomach sink further. "I didn't call anyone to fix the lights. Are you sure they were electricians?" I didn't know how to respond. I thought I was sure, but now doubts began creeping in. They hadn't shown any ID or even introduced themselves, and I hadn't asked for any credentials. They'd just been there, working like they belonged. My mind raced, replaying the morning in flashes, small details I'd dismissed now surfacing with sharper edges. My heart pounded as I walked back down the hallway, staring up at the new lights, now feeling anything but ordinary. I checked the front door. It was locked, but that didn't ease my mind. I glanced around, trying to see if anything else had changed, if something felt out of place. The hallway was spotless, as though they'd wiped down every surface they'd touched, but there was still a faint metallic scent in the air, something sharp and lingering. I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I looked at those lights, my mind wandered back to the morning, replaying every detail in a loop that made me feel both ridiculous and strangely paranoid. I wanted to forget it, to go back to the comfort of thinking I'd just been overly suspicious. But the fact that Tom hadn't hired anyone and had no idea who they were, it made my skin crawl. I spent the day distracted, trying to focus on other things, but the strange encounter was like a persistent itch. I avoided walking down the hallway if I didn't have to, and I found myself glancing at the light fixtures out of the corner of my eye, half expecting to see something that would explain everything. But of course, they were just lights. Just ordinary, bright hallway lights. When my mom and Tom came home later that evening, I hesitated, not sure if I should bring it up. But the longer I waited, the more restless I felt, and I finally blurted it out over dinner. "Did either of you see anything weird about the hallway lights?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. They both looked up, surprise flickering across their faces. "What do you mean?" my mom asked, setting down her fork. "Well, this morning I heard a drilling sound, and I found two guys installing new lights in the hallway. I thought Tom had called them, but he said he didn't." Tom frowned, his expression shifting to one of concern. "I definitely didn't call anyone. Did they say where they were from?" "No," I replied, feeling the unease settle in again. "I didn't ask. I just assumed they were supposed to be here." Mom looked at Tom, and they shared a brief, tense glance. "Did you get their names?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "No. They just showed up, did the work, and left. I didn't think to ask until later." The more I explained it, the more surreal it sounded, and a sense of foolishness mixed with fear was settling over me. Why hadn't I questioned them more? Why had I been so quick to accept their presence? Tom stood up, walking into the hallway and glancing up at the lights. He studied them in silence for a moment before turning back to me. "I'll take a closer look at these tomorrow, maybe see if I can figure out who they were," he said. But I could tell from his expression that he was just as unnerved as I was, though he was trying to hide it. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Every small sound seemed amplified, every creak and groan of the house twisting into something sinister. Around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water, hoping it might help me calm down. But as I stepped into the hallway, a strange smell hit me. The faint, metallic scent from before, just only now it seemed stronger, hanging in the air like a ghostly presence. I froze, the glass of water forgotten in my hand. The smell was coming from the direction of the lights, sharp and pungent, almost like burned metal. I took a hesitant step closer, glancing up at the fixtures, half expecting them to be flickering or doing something strange. But they were perfectly steady, casting the same bright glow they had all day. Then, as I stood there, I felt a sudden chill, a sense of being watched that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned quickly, looking around, but there was nothing there, just the shadows stretching across the walls. The hallway was empty, silent except for my own breathing. Yet the feeling of unease grew with every second. I could swear the air had thickened, a tension that seemed to press down on me, urging me to leave, to get away from those lights. I hurried back to my room, closing the door behind me and leaning against it, trying to shake off the lingering sensation of being watched. But even with the door shut, I could still feel the lights, as if their presence was reaching through the walls, piercing into my thoughts. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, Tom looked at the fixtures again, tapping around them and trying to see if there was anything unusual. "They seem fine," he said, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. "But I'm going to call a few places and see if anyone in the area had contractors working here by mistake." He spent a good part of the day calling different companies, each conversation ending in the same way. No one had sent workers to our address. There were no reports of work orders, no notes of any team being in our area. With every call, I felt the unease in my chest grow heavier, as if each dead end was pulling us further into something we didn't understand. That evening, as I sat in my room trying to focus on a book, I heard the faintest hum. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the house settling, but as I listened closer, I realized it was the same faint buzzing I'd heard when the men were working. I opened my door and looked into the hallway, my pulse quickening as the sound grew louder, sharper, almost like drilling. But there was no one there, just the lights, casting their bright, steady glow. The sound stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway, leaving an unnatural silence behind. My hands were shaking as I backed into my room, closing the door and pressing my ear against it, listening for anything that might explain the strange noise. But everything was quiet, eerily so, like the house itself was holding its breath. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around the house. I'd come home to find lights turned on that I was certain I'd left off. The doors, which we always kept locked, would sometimes be found slightly ajar. Once, I found my phone on the kitchen counter, even though I knew I'd left it in my room. Each incident felt like a small invasion, a subtle disturbance that seemed to chip away at the normal rhythm of our home. One evening, after finding the front door unlocked for the third time that week, Tom installed new locks on every door and window. He was calm on the surface, but I could tell that the strange events were starting to weigh on him too. We all tried to act like things were normal, like nothing was wrong, but the tension in the air was palpable, an unspoken dread that none of us wanted to address. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whatever those men had done when they'd installed those lights had somehow changed the house. It was a ridiculous thought, but every creak, every flicker of the lights felt loaded with a strange, malicious energy. The tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Every little noise set my nerves on edge, and I found myself jumping at shadows, checking the locks on my door twice before going to bed. The strange occurrences hadn't stopped, and the more time passed, the more certain I was that those men had done something far beyond installing new lights. One night, I heard the buzzing sound again, faint but persistent, like an old, broken radio humming from somewhere deep within the walls. I sat up, listening, my skin prickling as the sound grew louder. This time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from downstairs, near the basement door. I hesitated, unsure if I was brave enough to investigate. But the noise was relentless, vibrating through the walls, filling every corner of the house. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and crept down the stairs. The house felt darker than usual, every shadow seeming to reach out, making me feel as if I were being pulled toward the source of the noise. When I reached the basement door, I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The noise was louder here, almost as if something inside was alive, moving with a low, mechanical hum. Steeling myself, I opened the door and flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The basement remained dark, the overhead light apparently burnt out. I hesitated, then aimed my phone's flashlight down the narrow staircase, illuminating the familiar clutter of old boxes and furniture. But something was wrong. There, tucked away in the farthest corner, was a faint, blinking red light. I didn't remember anything like that being down there before. Swallowing my fear, I descended the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. The red light blinked steadily, almost like it was waiting for me. As I drew closer, I realized it was attached to a small black device that had been wired to the fuse box. I didn't know much about electrical systems, but I could tell this wasn't part of the standard setup. Someone had put it there, and I was almost certain it had been those men. I examined the device, noticing tiny wires running from it, connected to a small lens mounted on the wall, like a hidden camera. My breath hitched as the realization dawned on me. They hadn't been electricians, they'd been setting up surveillance, wiring our house to be watched. But watched by who? And for what reason? A flood of horror filled me as I thought back to all the little incidents. The unlocked doors, the misplaced objects, the lights that flickered at odd hours. It wasn't just random, it was deliberate. Someone had been monitoring us, watching our routines, coming in and out when we weren't home. Panicking, I yanked the device from the fuse box, tearing it free along with the wires. The buzzing noise stopped immediately, plunging the basement into an almost complete silence, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator upstairs. I clutched the device in my hand, the red light now dead, and made my way back up the stairs, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Back in the living room, I called Tom and my mom, explaining in a rush what I'd found. They were silent as I spoke, and I could hear the shock and horror in their voices as I described the device and the hidden camera. We agreed to call the police immediately. When the officers arrived, they listened carefully to everything, asking about the men I'd seen and the strange occurrences that had followed. They took to the device, examining it with a mixture of curiosity and concern, but they couldn't offer any immediate answers. "We'll look into this and see if we can trace where it came from," one of the officers assured us. "But it's a good thing you found it. This kind of surveillance, it's not just invasive, it's illegal." As they left, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. The device was gone, but the feeling of violation lingered, as if those strangers had left a mark on our home that couldn't simply be erased. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone somewhere was still watching, waiting. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house changed. We replaced the locks, removed every light fixture the men had touched, and went through every inch of the house, searching for anything else they might have left behind. But even with the new lights and locks, the unease remained. The house felt colder, emptier, like a sense of safety had been peeled away, leaving us exposed. I started having trouble sleeping, haunted by memories of those men and the faint buzzing that seemed to echo in my mind. Some nights I could swear I heard it again, a faint hum, drifting from somewhere I couldn't quite pinpoint. I'd lie in bed listening, my body tense, waiting for it to stop. Sometimes I'd get up, checking every room, only to find nothing but silence. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, never left me. One evening, as I lay awake, I heard my phone buzz with a notification. I picked it up, expecting it to be a text from a friend, but it was a message from an unknown number. The words on the screen made my blood run cold. "We'll be back soon. Don't worry about the lights." My hands trembled as I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't recognize the number, and when I tried to call it back, there was no answer. I checked with my mom and Tom, but they hadn't received anything similar. The police took the message seriously when we reported it the next day, but there was little they could do beyond adding it to the case file. They told us to stay vigilant and encouraged us to install additional security measures. We followed their advice, setting up cameras, adding motion sensor lights, and even installing an alarm system. But despite all our efforts, the house never felt the same. The weeks passed, and eventually the strange occurrences stopped. The buzzing noise faded into memory, and the lights remained steady, just like any ordinary fixtures. Life gradually returned to normal, though we were all more cautious, more aware of our surroundings. But even now, months later, I sometimes feel it. The faintest prickling at the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. Every so often, I'll catch a flicker in the corner of my eye, like a shadow shifting just out of sight. And whenever I walk down that hallway, I still find myself glancing up at the lights, half expecting them to flicker, to buzz, as if the house is reminding me that those men, and whoever they worked for, might still be out there, watching and waiting.